high on the agenda. Marco Rubio will not attend in a rare absence for the US Secretary of State. Deutsche Welle correspondent Lars Halter joins us now from Berlin. Lars, good day. So what's expected from this meeting?
Yeah, that's very hard to say, especially since not much is known as of now about what exactly came out of last night's meeting that you have just mentioned here between the U.S. delegation and Vladimir Putin. But as you said, I mean, Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, not being present in Brussels today, that is something we haven't really seen ever before. Of course, you know, he's sending his second in command, and it is obviously the U.S. prerogative to decide who they're sending to a NATO meeting. But this we haven't seen in decades, and NATO made that clear that this is just an outrageous and a never before seen development here. And obviously, it's part of what we've seen for years now under President Trump and his America First policy, that NATO is just not very high on America's agenda anymore. And the level of disdain the U.S. Currently has for this most important military alliance can actually be best derived maybe from a statement out of Washington, where they very simply state that Rubio, quote, can't possibly be expected to attend every meeting.
And so what does that indicate about the state of the US-NATO relationship?
Well, you know, if we follow the statement on Rubio's absence a bit more, it continues to explain that Rubio, again, I quote, has had dozens of meetings with NATO partners, and one can't help to read some frustration and a lack of interest between the lines. Of course, there's always high-level NATO meetings, but that is due to the important role that the alliance plays on the global stage. Regular meetings are a strategy and not a nuisance. However, the Trump administration clearly doesn't value NATO, and in Brussels they know that they have to plan without Washington in future. NATO partners have, of course, increased their military spending over the last couple of years to be less dependent on the U.S. But there's also another aspect. If we're going back 2 weeks to when Trump's so-called peace plan that you also just alluded to, when that peace plan for Ukraine came out, this 28-point plan on how to end the conflict, there's 2 points that concerned NATO directly. One, that NATO could not admit any new members, and then secondly, that any long-term negotiations between Russia and NATO should be discussed under U.S. leadership. That very much sounds like Washington does no longer see itself as a member and integral part of NATO, but much more as a neutral force outside the alliance. And as for NATO reactions to all this, Secretary General Mark Rutte said that he's, of course, in constant contact with the U.S. and with Rubio, and that he understands Rubio's busy schedule. So NATO and Rutte here trying to de-escalate a bit.
And so what are the implications from this for Ukraine and the prospect of ending the war?
Well, that's the main question, of course. Ukraine depends on financial and military help from NATO, including very much the United States. And Ukraine has experienced, like no other country, how President Trump's mood swings can affect policy or, for Ukraine's sheer survival. A U.S. delegation, as we just mentioned, has now met with Putin last night in Moscow, and we don't know much about what came out of this meeting. But we do know that in latest developments in general, Trump, of course, seemed to align himself much more with Russia again than with Ukraine, as of late promoting that peace plan that looked to many observers like a document straight from the Kremlin. And NATO member countries seem to be trying to fix a few things and strengthen Ukraine's position now to counter this initial plan, which was, of course, unacceptable to Kiev, but also to Western partners, as that original document seemed to reward and even encourage one country's aggression. But while NATO partners are now discussing military help and the possible conditions of an end to the war and territorial questions and so much more, Ukraine likely knows, as do the NATO members, that any commitment by the U.S. is just weak and unreliable, and that just gets underscored by the absence of Rubio missing, because Rubio would likely find it relatively easy now even to renegotiate anything coming out of Brussels today, if only by stating that he had never signed on in the first place.
Okay, Lars Halter there in Berlin. Time now for finance. Here's